from the JLE in London, you're listening to History for the Curious, the podcast. 20 minutes with Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch, hosted by myself, Menat Reisner. Join us as we cross continents, sail through the centuries, tracing lives, uncovering events, and following epic journeys to reveal the untold stories and the mysteries that have impacted our history and shaped us into who we are today.
Clement Attlee testified how one day he met Churchill in the House of Commons, and Churchill told him about what was being inflicted on the Jews, and he had tears pouring down his cheeks. And, this sense of outrage never left him. Churchill would make repeated references to different audiences to it being the most horrible crime ever committed in history. And this is how generally Churchill is known of, and it's true. But there is an issue.
The issue that they weren't actually bombed.
So, simply put, to what degree was this admirable sentiment of Churchill followed by any meaningful action? Now, the reason generally given is that the bureaucrats were able to thwart the will of even the most powerful prime minister in British history, but actually is little to show that he subsequently pushed his ministers or pressed his officials to actually do something. It is also argued that the Air Force losses would have been too great, and it's argued that Churchill was too preoccupied with larger issues of running the war, because this is all a month since the D-Day invasion of France.
I guess anyway you could say it isn't the job of a prime minister. He gives directives.
Right. So that all is sort of part of the argument that's made. But these arguments are weakened by Churchill's strong involvement in another episode happening at exactly the same time. On the 1st of August 1944, the Polish Home Army rebelled against the Nazis. By then, the Soviets had already occupied half of Poland, Lublin, etc., and this uprising took place in Warsaw principally. The British government made every effort to fly in or fly in aid anyway, to the Polish revolt. The RAF was ordered to drop supplies on Warsaw, despite warnings that losses would be prohibitive, and that the chances of the supplies reaching the Poles were minimal anyway. In fact, of 181 bombers which flew to Warsaw, 31 did not return. And on one day alone, 1,280 supply canisters were dropped, and only 280 reached Polish hands. The rest fell to the Germans. And in all of this, Churchill took a personal interest. He followed the progress via the Air Ministry. He sent personal appeals to Stalin, and both the Auschwitz request and the Warsaw uprising occur not only at the same time, but in the same geographical area. So that at the very same time that British officials were explaining to the Jews that Allied planes didn't have the capacity to reach Auschwitz, the planes were actually flying just to the west of Krakow, virtually over Auschwitz itself, on the way to Warsaw. Now, it's true that the Americans were in overall charge of the European theatre of war, and that the American government expressed zero sympathy or any level of interest in the Jews. So clearly Churchill was much more of a human being. Nevertheless, he never created an actual policy for it, as he did for Warsaw, where there was almost no American involvement. He just gave this idea of bombing Auschwitz the initial direction, but the idea died, and so unfortunately did many Jews.
Well, the picture you paint just seems very confusing, with the tears running down the cheeks and the largest crime ever committed in history, and we know he had the ability to give direction, even if it might not have been his court as prime minister, and the fact that the planes were flying does paint the picture that this could have been all some sort of an act.
It definitely was not an act. There's no question about it, and we saw, for instance, what he did in Algiers and what he did in Palestine. There was no question about the fact that he was on the side of the Jews, but in one way or another there were other considerations which either took his time or took his focus, or that he wanted to pick his battles. But, ultimately, this can be considered a failure of his. That, I would say, is the way to view it.